Okay, great. Thank you. So by way of introduction, various models suggest that the volume of shock melt produced by an impact scales roughly as the transient cavity diameter produced by that impact raised to the fourth power. And what that means, since even fairly small impacts on the moon produce tens of cubic kilometers of melt, is that really large basin-forming impacts are going to produce enormous volumes of melt, millions, tens of millions of cubic kilometers. Okay? And I think it's safe to say that we understand the geology and petrology of the relatively small volumes of melt occurring in complex craters better than we do the enormous volumes of melt occurring in lunar basins. And the topic of my talk is going to be the geology and petrology of these huge basin impact melt deposits. Okay, and this is important. A calculation suggests that all lunar basin-forming impacts combined produce on the order of 10 to the 8 cubic kilometers of impact melt. And that means that about 1/20th of the lunar crust is impact melt. So if we want to understand the lunar crust, we had better understand these huge volumes of impact melt as well. Okay, so where on the moon should we go to study this impact melt? What lunar basin should we look at? Not a basin like Imbrium, which is totally flooded with Mare basalt. Better to look at a relatively young, fresh basin like Orientale, where we can see the impact melt. Okay, so first I'm going to look at the geology of massive deposits of impact melt in the Orientale basin. Think about their volume, distribution, and thickness, and then I'll model their petrology and think about the general implications. Okay, so first, geology. How much impact melt was produced by the Orientale forming impact? Okay, so for a slow-moving chondritic projectile coming in normal to the surface, producing an Orientale-sized transient cavity, you get about 6 million cubic kilometers of melt. And this is almost certainly an overestimate, just because there's evidence that the Orientale forming impactor was pretty oblique, and oblique impacts produce less melt than vertical impacts. And apparently there are pretty strong constraints on the impact angle, and coupling those with the impact melt production models suggest that you only produce about a quarter of that amount of melt, 1.5 times 10 to the 6 cubic kilometers. Okay. A lot of this melt is going to get excavated in forming the transient cavity. It's going to be ejected from the basin interior. It's been estimated that this amounts to about 25 volume% of the melt. So you end up with 1.1 times 10 to the 6 cubic kilometers of melt inside the basin. And now the problem is to account for that melt in the geology and to see where it ends up. Okay. So happily, occurring inside the Orientale basin are two facies that have historically been interpreted as impact melt related, a rough facies and a smooth facies. Okay, so how much impact melt is represented in each of these facies? So the rough facies is thought to be a relatively clast-rich impact melt, very thinly draping on the peaks of the Innerrhook Mountains. And the relatively small aerial extent of this melt, its clast-rich nature, its relatively thin inferred thickness, all of these put a pretty severe upper limit on the amount of impact melt in this facies. Okay, so I estimate optimistically that there's maybe 100,000 cubic kilometers of melt accounted for here, and that leaves 1 million cubic kilometers of melt to occur in this central smooth facies, which is thought to be a relatively pure impact melt sheet. This smooth facies is about 10 to the 5 square kilometers in area, so by volume balance, that means it has to be on the order of 10 kilometers thick. This isn't totally ridiculous. There are impact melt sheets on Earth, the subarachneous complex, that are about 3 kilometers thick in craters maybe half the size of Orientale. And moreover, there's some independent geologic evidence for a really thick impact melt sheet on Orientale. Namely, the smooth facies is depressed by about 2 kilometers below the surrounding rough facies. And you can interpret this vertical downdropping as the vertical shrinkage of an impact melt sea as it undergoes solidification and cooling. Okay, and the amount of shrinkage actually constrains the thickness of that melt sea, and you can estimate that the melt sea is again about on the order of 10 kilometers thick, maybe 15 kilometers thick. Okay, so there are two lines of evidence for a really thick, maybe 15-kilometer thick, a body of impact melt, an impact melt sheet, maybe better described as an impact melt sea, at the center of the Orientale basin. And if you have a huge body of impact melt, the natural question is, did that impact melt undergo igneous differentiation? And I think for Orientale, the answer is likely yes, okay? Because terrestrial impact melt sheets, a tenth of the thickness, a hundredth of the volume, have extensively differentiated. Sudbury, Manicouagan, Morakwang in South Africa. So it seems likely that the Orientale melt sheet also differentiated. And I'll go ahead and walk you through a model of the igneous differentiation and come up with the cumulative stratigraphy of a possible solidified Orientale melt sea. Okay, and unfortunately I have to elide parts of this model because of time constraints, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask me later. Okay, so what's the bulk composition of the Orientale melt sea? I just calculate this by superposing the melting volume on the structure of the pre-existing crust and mantle, okay, and then mixing in the appropriate proportions. And in fact, the melt sea is largely mafic. Nearly half of this melt volume is mantle material, okay. There's going to be a strong thermal gradient in this melt lake. It's super hot melt, a really cold free surface up top, and you expect that thermal gradient to drive vigorous convection. Okay, so it seems likely that this melt is well mixed and homogenized so that the bulk composition of the melt is equal to the composition of the differentiating liquid. Okay, so I'll consider the crystallization sequence of that differentiating liquid, and I'll consider equilibrium crystallization because you expect very vigorous convection to keep crystals and liquid in equilibrium. Okay, so the melt lake's really mafic. It's initially olivine saturated. You're going to crystallize olivine. Eventually the liquid will become so silicic that it starts to resorb olivine. You crystallize orthopyroxene. And finally you eat up the rest of your liquid, making orthopyroxene and anorthite at the paratectic. Now the problem is to convert this crystallization sequence into a stratigraphic sequence by seeing whether crystals are going to sink or float. Okay, and the particularly important crystal is plagioclase. And my density calculations based on partial molar volumes suggest that plagioclase never floats in plagioclase-saturated melts. And if plagioclase never floats, olivine and pyroxene aren't going to float either. This has the upshot that everything sinks. So my crystallization sequences are effectively stratigraphic sequences. Okay, if you're crystallizing plagioclase and pyroxene, they're both going to sink and you'll form norite. And then finally I do some modal calculations to get the weight proportions of these various lithologies, just mass balance, kind of. Okay, and I come up with these modeled cumulative stratigraphies for the Orientale melt sea. And I've considered not just equilibrium crystallization of a homogeneous melt lake, but also fractional crystallization. And I've thought about what might happen if mafic and felsic liquids split apart, which is a process that's been suggested to operate in Sudbury. Okay, so the question is, are any of these cumulative stratigraphies real? Are any of them consistent with compositional constraints on the Orientale melt sea at depth? And I think, yeah, this one. The complex crater Maunder has a neritic central peak. It's excavating norite from about 4 kilometers depth. Okay, and norite at 4 kilometers depth is most consistent with this model, okay, of equilibrium crystallization of a homogeneous melt lake. And that makes sense because of vigorous convection, you expect both these processes to dominate. A little more puzzlingly, the top of the impact melt sea seems to be anorthositic. It's harder to produce anorthosite because plagioclase is always going to sink in these melt lakes. Maybe it's a fallback breccia, maybe it's some kind of quench crust. or maybe it results from like modal separation of plagioclase and pyroxene in late crystallizing melt. Okay, let me generalize. What might the cumulative stratigraphy of melt seas occurring in other lunar basins be like? Bulk composition, taking the structure of the lunar crust as everywhere uniform, is going to be a function of basin size. Okay, so that small basins are going to melt mainly the crust, large basins are going to melt mainly the mantle. Okay, and the watershed here is the anorthite forsterite cotectic. Okay, and small basins are going to have initially plagioclase saturated melt. I've thought about basins with initially olivine saturated melt. That was just Orientale. So I'll walk through one of these smaller basins. Okay, and it's going to initially crystallize a plagioclase. It's initially plagioclase saturated. And this plagioclase is going to sink to form a massive anorthosite layer at the bottom of the impact melt sea. Okay, so a crustal melt sea might be distinguishable from a mantle melt sea by its density structure. Okay, as much as anything. It has this inverted density structure due to this basal anorthosite layer. And all these melt seas seem to be topped with norite. So maybe when you see the noritic floor of SPA, you can interpret it as a melt differentiate. Okay, one last thing. I know that impact melt differentiates are slow cooled. They're probably coarse grained. And they might not be all that siderophile rich either, particularly if siderophiles are going to fractionate into some kind of metal or sulfide layer. And that means that impact melt differentiates might be able to pass for pristine hyaline plutonic rocks. Okay, so it's possible that many of the rocks in the lunar sample suite, norites and orthosites, that we think are pristine, actually formed in these impact melt sheets. Okay, so to wrap up, most of the impact melt produced by Orientale goes to form this really thick, tens of kilometers thick melt sheet. This melt sheet probably differentiates, and my models of this differentiation are consistent with compositional constraints on the melt sea. Basin-forming impacts melting mainly the lunar crust, unlike Orientale, have a different chemistry, produce a different resulting cumulative stratigraphy, maybe with an inverted density structure. And impact melt differentiates could well pass for pristine. And I just want to point out in finishing that the great data collected by MQ, by LRO, by Crail, is going to make it very possible to really probe the geology and petrology of these massive melt sheets. Thanks.
Okay, we have time for a question. Sir.
Yeah, Larry Taylor, University of Tennessee. Yeah, it was a very fine presentation. I think that you've hit on a major thing that we found with Apollo 14, and that is there's things called melt rocks, and they're all over the place. And they're very difficult to distinguish between a normal indigenous igneous rock. And I think that's why we came up with iridium. We'd look for iridium in these things to see if they were pristine igneous rocks versus contaminated. But I think that what you have here is you're going to have a sample regime that's not going to have much of any kind of meteoritic signature. And so you've got melt rocks that it's going to be hard to really tell the difference between that and a true igneous lunar rock. So I think you're emphasizing this. Jim has been doing this for a long time. The melt pockets and all these impact melts. I think they're going to play a bigger and bigger part as we go on in looking at all these huge impact craters.
Okay, thanks. I agree.